In this session, we'll talk about the Transportation Data Equity Initiative. And specifically, we're going to interrogate why we need data infrastructure and tooling to further access to mobility and transportation. Up till now, in the past 2 days, we talked a lot about service coordination. We talked about barriers for riders and how we can potentially improve the rider experience. Now we're going to take a look at how we can improve the data producer's experience to promote more stewardship and more open data sharing among transportation providers so that they're able to address those barriers and needs of riders. And so the goal of this session is to foster a meaningful dialogue about open, multimodal, interoperable, accessibility-first transportation data sharing, a platform for that sharing, and the different tools and open APIs that producers and consumers might need in order to have an open data exchange that actually maintains and keeps the data up to date. So that is our goal in the Transportation Data Equity Initiative. I'll do tiny introductions and I'm going to cut through all of it. Since you'll have your slides, you'll be able to see everybody who's involved in this awesome project that I'm so excited and proud to introduce you to. My name is Anat Caspi. I'm the development lead for this project. Bill Howe will be speaking next. And is the systems development lead for our project. And there are many amazing people involved. I wish I could give a discussion about each and every one of them because really it's been an awesome team to work with, and I'm so excited about it. So the project is a multimodal effort led by the ITS JPO. They are our sponsor, and you can visit other ITS for Us deployments. There are 4 current projects who are sort of following the same growth pattern, and the link is provided there. So briefly, please, if you're interested in actually having any kind of hands-on access to the system, to the prototype system, sign up at this form. The agenda for today, it will not be 10 a.m. again, but I just rammed through the introductions and welcome. We will have a quick review on the purpose and mission of this project, and then we'll talk about what is the platform and how does it support the data lifecycle for transportation data producers as well as consumers. And then we'll do some walkthroughs of real-world asks that we've received from producers and consumers and how they might be able to implement those in using the system. And finally, we'll have sort of a data consumer discussion that we're hoping to float some potential issues you found, some additional concerns and use cases you might have, et cetera. So moving right along, the mission and vision of our project is, I'm often asked, why are we focusing on data rather than equity in the built environment itself? So we're asking why transportation data equity. I think the past day and a half has sort of discussed that, but in summary, and this is where I'm going to cut some time, really the equity gaps are where people experience informational gaps, as we found, or providers don't have the information from the ground that they need in order to assess first, metricize, and then address some of the gaps that are experienced by riders. So if we're talking about training gaps, for example, like yesterday, having some data on that and how that can be communicated back to service providers is really important. If we're talking about coordination of rides across different service providers, which Paolo just addressed in his talk, how do we get operational data to be open and shared across providers so that transfer from one provider to the next is seamless and what Arius experienced yesterday in his story is not experienced by other writers. And so active data management and measurement of some of these aspects that impact writers and their experiences is really the tie-in, at least the way I see it. And that is the mission of the Transportation Data Equity Initiative in terms of providing a platform where it's not just essentially a high-end Google Drive to push your data, but it's a data exchange system that allows and provides the actual tooling ecosystem for different stakeholders to engage with the data, use the data on an ongoing basis, which was what drives maintenance and being current and up to date. So the official objectives of the TDI is first to create, improve, and extend data formats to describe sidewalks, footpaths in the built environment, as well as transportation service providers for on-demand transportation. And then create and deploy a federated data sharing, management, and distribution platform with open APIs for those data specifications. And of course, we hope to eventually grow into other specs, like if we could help with the tooling ecosystems for ODS or for TDS, for different operational data, that would be great. At present, we're really focused on open sidewalks for sidewalk data, on GTFS pathways for transit environment data, and GTFS Flex, as we discussed yesterday, for on-demand transportation services. And while two of those are actually now officially part of GTFS, we're hoping that the tooling provided here is what will attract people to help manage some of those extensions, specifically, for example, in how to build and maintain a data set for a transit station. And then the reach goal is really to deploy planner dashboards that consume this standardized data to demonstrate both the versatility and scalability of that data infrastructure. Okay, so what is lacking currently out there? There are different kinds of barriers for institutional partners to do this kind of work at scale presently, and everyone is experiencing this pain on their own. And what we're hoping to do is create a single platform that allows all these different pain points to be addressed for different stakeholders at the same time. I'll move on. So I am going to actually cut that time that I was talking about by not talking about all the principles that we're responsive to. And so I'll move directly to how do I know the TDI will help me publish and maintain data within my institutional constraints. And I'll pause for a minute and let you ingest this pretty dense slide image. What the image is showing is essentially a central repository for transportation data. And we know that one exists. Like, for example, there are transportation data hubs out there. Mobility Data is building one. There's Transitland, other ways to identify hubs of transportation data. The current challenge is that different stakeholders don't have a good loop feedback system that they're able to both consume and sync back some of their data into that hub. And so others might be driven to do something like using OpenStreetMap, which has its own institutional challenges and barriers, because it is much more open and allows for more stakeholders to engage in that system. What we're trying to do is find a middle ground in between those. One in which it's not just a broadcasting system, right? Like in Transitland, you just publish your data and then you publish it over it next time, but there's not really an adequate tooling for data exchange and ongoing updates and things like that. But it's not quite as open as OSM is in the sense of like different stakeholders are equitably contributing their data back, and there's no real release schedule, no real way to track history. Well, there is a way to track history, but it's not as clear as an archival way of identifying, oh, okay, this was release version 1.2 for year 2018, published by King County Metro, and this is what they vetted and signed. And some of our institutional partners absolutely need that kind of structure and therefore are unable to use OSM, OpenStreetMap. There are other concerns about OSM with licensing and other things like that. So these are some of the things that we're trying to bridge between a completely open and shared system with no real data specifications versus something that is much more locked down, but is kind of a broadcast-only kind of environment. So what is the TDI platform and how does it support data lifecycle for transportation data producers and consumers? For this, I will hand it over to Bill Howe, our TDI system development lead.
Thanks, and I'll introduce myself because I was an original face maybe in this project and was involved in the original proposal, but then I stepped away for a little while and rejoined back in August. I'll continue with a couple of other slides here. You know, my expertise, so I'm on the faculty here at University of Washington in the Information School. My PhD's in computer science, and we used to build big data systems in a lot of different areas, and I've always had a bit of an applied bend. I used to hang out with oceanographers and astronomers and so forth and try to build data systems for them. And then around 2016, I kind of turned attention more toward the public sector, and that's where I had connected with Anat and Mark Hallenbach and some other folks around campus who were building similar kind of systems. So this overall view that Anat was sharing about the balance that needs to be struck between stringent standards that make the system difficult to use and very flexible general purpose repositories that end up falling a bit flat in providing utility for applications. And I would argue that the open data movement, while very successful in a lot of ways, and I was involved in that, probably people in the room were involved in trying to push that vision of transparency in government. Overall, it really didn't deliver on the promise, in part because it was the lack of these standards, right? So it ended up being many for, you know, so Socrata and some other companies helped hundreds of cities all around the world publish data and improve government transparency, but the ecosystem of startups and tools and so forth didn't really materialize the same way some people envisioned. And my view of that is in part because it became kind of a pool of CSV files, right? And so you ended up having to kind of do your own work to discover the data and download it and work with it, and that was kind of hard. So there's striking this balance between too much structure and too little structure is a difficult thing to do when you're building these repositories, and I think that with Anat's vision and the exceptional professionalism of the team of software engineers we have, we've done a pretty good job with that. Okay, so the lack of standards is clearly an issue in this arena, as we heard yesterday. The overall lifecycle support is something that we take seriously here, where it's not just dump it out there. As not really described this, but there's a pretty big difference between data that you're still working on versus data that's released, and so we build that into the lifecycle. And I'm not going to, for time purposes, maybe I won't go through this overall process. The point maybe I want to make. Let me sort of stride through here a little bit. The other, so there's this two failure modes of too much structure and too little structure. That is one sort of point that I've learned over the last 15 years and kind of been trying to build these kinds of systems. The other one is the value of a standard. And I was telling some people yesterday, one of my favorite examples of the way to do standards correctly is KML. And one of the reasons why I think it was successful is because the killer app was built in concert with the standard, right? People saw Google Earth and they said, that's really interesting. I want to have my data in Google Earth. And therefore, I'm incentivized to work with whatever standard it takes to get that access to that application. And so the lesson learned in that context is build those killer apps alongside the development of the standard, and that's something we're trying to develop in this project as well with AccessMap and the editing tools that we'll see in a second. All right, so this slide is making the point I just made a couple of minutes ago, where in every field of science and every field of the public sector as well, there are attempts at these repositories with varying degrees of success. On the your right there is one of, not the only one by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the examples of a colossal boondoggle in this space. So this was a $300+ million project from federal money designed to organize and hoover up and serve out all the cancer-related data in the U.S. and the world. And essentially, it went dark with never having a single data set uploaded to it. And part of the problem was that the metadata standards were so Byzantine and so sort of complex and trying to be so complete that no one could really sort of work with it. Another example, maybe not on the slide, there's sort of this spectrum here of how much are you favoring the people who are writing the data, or are you favoring people who are reading the data? Other examples are, in oceanography, I was telling the story yesterday, so I'll tell it again, where, you feel like you went to a meeting where they're debating how to do units of salinity measurements, and then 5 years later I went back to the meeting and they were debating some of the same issues. And so this kind of standard development can really be a source of paralysis in delivering actual applications. And so striking that balance tends to be the difference between living or dying in this space. All right. So complete lack of data standards for representation of accessibility-related data elements is something we've talked about in the last couple of days. Given the focus on manual vetting that is required in this space, given the community engagement, given the needs out in the of individuals and small groups of people who are underrepresented in the mainstream conversation, there's a lot of high-touch interaction that needs to happen. So tools to be able to support that kind of collaboration is a paramount requirement. No single place to get aggregated data, and I'll say more maybe at the end about what I mean by aggregated data, but another kind of lesson in these data repositories is that the value of these data repositories scales quadratically with the number of data sets in it. And what I mean by that is every time you combine two data sets, you end up kind of with another data set that might empower other applications, right? So, a data set filled with light posts alone is not terribly useful. There's maybe not much you can do with it, but when you join that with the sidewalks, now you can enable lighting, routing features, and that kind of integrative game is what we're playing. And my sense from joining this project and talking to folks who are doing this kind of work, including on our own team, is that a lot of that work is happening individually thanks to the heroic efforts of GIS wizards and other kinds of folks, and we're trying to figure out what kind of patterns can we see from that work and standardize and push back to the server in order to bring that out. So rather than just sort of doing the data exchange of, your high quality sidewalk data set will now be exchanged with someone else over there, that's valuable, as we've seen, but how can we augment that and extend that and add value to that and then exchange it as well? All right. And then lack of confidence in the available open data sources. A paramount requirement in this space is to have some degree of computable confidence and quality measures that can then be relied on. And so we have a number of different projects that are exploring different notions of confidence and quality and building that into the system so that you can query for data sets that meet these requirements and start to advance the conversation around confidence and quality, as opposed to having to, take the data set that fell off the back of the truck and assume that it's good enough for your application. All right. So in lifting up all these ideas and systematizing them within the TDI platform, we're hoping to kind of change the way that people interact with data sets. All right. I think I might stride through that. The architecture that's been developed here is, given that some of these tasks that we want to support, say confidence computation or some of the joins, they are, non-trivial computation that has to happen on top of the data, right? So it's not just pulling it in and serving it, it's actually doing some non-trivial computation on there, which means we have this asynchronous, job-oriented set of requirements, which motivates a microservice, loosely coupled bus architecture, which is rare among these federally funded projects. So we're trying to use these modern architectures and modern applications, frameworks, and development strategies to deliver this. And so, you know, you'll have, this is not a complete list of all the things that we're doing here, but there's a confidence score calculation. Validation alone can take longer and longer depending on what you mean by validation. You can check that the format matches requirements pretty cheaply, but when you're looking at compliance with a particular schema, that gets a little bit more expensive. When you're looking at non-trivial things that need to check elements that may be distant in space, it can get even more expensive, and so these things can be some heavyweight computation that happens in order to deliver on this vision of providing usable, high-quality data to all applications. All right. The language we're adopting as of fairly recently for the core components here, there's a TDI core component that I'm mostly going to talk about and show in a few moments, which is, you know, you think about Amazon Web Services, or something else, or Azure or any other cloud platform. The API is the main thing, right? There's also an interface. There's also kind of a set of tools around it to interact directly through a browser. Excuse me. And we are delivering a similar experience, but the APIs are really what the selling point is. So this is programmatic access, and that's what I'm going to show today. So you're going to see, you know, Python code and so forth, as opposed to whiz-bang applications for part of it. All right. The TDI Workspaces provides a arena for connecting editing tools, and a key requirement in this space is that there already is an existing community of ecosystem of tools that exists around OSM, and so needing to be able to communicate with that ecosystem is important. However, direct interaction with OSM is sometimes limited not by technical barriers, but by data licensing and some of the procedures they have. And so we want the technical interoperability with that ecosystem, but we don't necessarily not all applications can support their socio-technical requirements, and so we've developed a private OSM environment with which you can connect those tools, and we'll see one example of that in a moment. The third component that's near and dear to my heart as a data management person is what we're calling TDI Query, and you know, being able to crack open these files and do non-trivial things with them is an important element as well. So the very simplest thing, if you can just, you know, take a bounding box and pull out a segment of that data set and download that, that's already something that's bigger and better than just sort of sharing opaque atomic files around that you then have to sort of work with locally on your own servers. But, you know, it doesn't stop there. We're interested in, as I mentioned, the joins and enrichment and unioning things together and so forth. So that will be we'll wrap up at the end here with a little bit of a discussion around use cases we might want to see in this space. We have a couple of these implemented right now, but we're interested in sort of supporting more and more of these kinds of non-trivial things. You know, things that you wish you didn't have to do locally and you wish that you could do server side. We're in the business of considering whether we can incorporate that into our set of requirements. I should also say that this whole demo today is, you know, approximately 9 months early than we're really required to deliver it. So we're doing pretty well on schedule. But when we pause and say things aren't implemented yet, give us a break, because we're already quite far ahead of the game. All right, and so then, as I mentioned, you know, if you just built this kind of a system, it's really difficult to design these things in a vacuum. And so, in concert, we're building these applications along with it to keep ourselves honest about whether the standards are too onerous for someone to work with. And we hopefully will discover that before you have to deal with it, because we will have hashed out those details while we have crosstalk between the teams that are working on this. All right, so. I mentioned microservices and the bus architecture. Everything is open source. We're following these agile development processes, which means, again, if we do hear requirements at these kinds of events, we're happy to try to take those back in. We're interested in that. That's why we're doing it. That's why we're pushing ourselves to give these demos earlier than, in some cases, than we necessarily need to be, according to our deployment schedule. And then we're having an ongoing conversation about performance metrics and system monitoring and so forth as well. You know, I think there's some milestone that was reached recently in terms of miles of pedestrian footpaths that we have in the system. We're looking at what kind of ways can we keep ourselves operating at a high level with respect to metrics that people are interested in having. So, you know, not just number of, you know, you could cheat on any one of these metrics, number of miles of pedestrian footpaths. Well, what if they're all bad or they don't match the built environment? Then that's not particularly useful. And so we're having that discussion as well. All right. So with that, let me switch over, and I'm going to try to do that relatively transparently here. So unlike the traditional demo where, you know, it only works on one laptop, that's not why we're switching. It's only switching because it needs some local computation, and I don't have that, and that's not anything we've set up. So you too can do this, everything we're doing here as well. In fact, I may ask you to, so. That work? Yeah. So TDI Core, again, the primary interface to this is the programmatic interface, but I'll show you the companion interactive application that one has really just for convenience as well. And so several of you now have users that are in the system, I think, that we prepared. And the process for you to actually log in, I think you can do this live right now. I guess we didn't share this URL though, so maybe you can read it off the screen, but that's a lot of typing. Let's see. Put it in chat, okay. And let's see, do I need to say a couple of words about the process for them to log in? I guess if they go there and if you've given your email address. Okay, so I'm going to click through some of these interfaces and share some of the design decisions briefly, and then we'll go through and try to do something real. So the overall structure of permissions and organization and user management is, we went back and forth on these designs a few times, but trying to keep it somewhat minimalist in general for the variable organizational structures that we see in practice. So there's a notion of project group, which is as opposed to a specific organization, because sometimes people are working across organizations, sometimes there's multiple projects within a single organization, and so it's kind of orthogonal to organizational structures. So within a project group, of which I'm a member of a few of them here, and you'll be a member of exactly one, I think, when you log in, we reserve the right to blow this away. This is a staging area. You will be able to use it after this event. We're committed to trying to keep it up and live, but we're not guaranteeing that yet until we actually have a real release. So if it does go away one day, don't fret. We'll bring it back shortly. So within a project group, that is really just a unit of permissions. So a bunch of users get together and say we are part of a project group, which means we're all going to have access to the same data sets, and we're all going to have control over those same data sets. Those data sets are then within what is essentially, which is essentially a namespace called services. And so this is the same way this community tends to use services in practice. So for this project group, there are a number of services that we've defined. All right. And so if you're a data producer, which is not our focus today for the demo, you can upload data sets. Let's say you're uploading an OSW formatted data set, you'll have a companion metadata file that provides the source and what data set it might have been derived from, and other aspects of to convey the provenance here of where it came from. That's not going to be our focus today, but you can do that, and that all works. What we are going to do today is access the data on the other side as a consumer. And so here, this is really just a convenience list of data sets we've added. You can see that there's a status here of released or pre-release. If you're within the project group, you can edit all of your pre-release data sets or work with them and download them, but no one else can see them until they're officially released, which we heard is a pretty loud requirement from a number of groups. All right, so that's core. Flipping back to the presentation for a moment to give you a roadmap of where we're going to go. The capabilities of producers, all producers can govern their own releases. They can govern archives and versions. We have a pretty prominent notion of data sets being derived from other data sets, so you can see the entire history there. They can use these common tools, and they can manage their own data licensing, that's what's complicated if we integrate too closely with OSM, because they put constraints on how licensing needs to happen. Open API consumers, which is what we're focusing on today, can access these programmatic interfaces whenever they want, and so can perform daily scrapes if that's of use. They can, in some cases, create direct visualizations. We can build these pipelines using modern API designs and protocols. Upon full release, perform data joins for data integration and support more flexible applications, as we said. Also to perform specialized one-off analyses. We're trying to think about, at one end of the spectrum is a complete GIS system that requires a lot of expertise and requires some deployment environment. And at the other end is do nothing, and all you can do is exchange the data. And we're trying to find that middle balance where some of this capability we can support without having to try to emulate QGIS or Esri. All right. Although in that last bullet, supporting plugins for QGIS to work with this data is also on the roadmap. All right. So with some of the questions that we hear from people at events like these, starting from just the bare bones capabilities that we might have, find all data sets available for a particular region, download a given data set, edit it using OSM compliant tools, empower collaborators to edit it using other tools besides core OSM tools. And then I'll mention at the end about some ideas we have around joining data sets and solicit feedback on where we should go with that. So let's get into actually doing something here. So if I want to see all available data in the Seattle region, I'm going to focus on a Python client, but you can, there's all REST APIs, so you can use whatever language you want. Actually, maybe one thing I'll quickly show here is, if this is the analog to Amazon Web Services console providing, that exercises these APIs, everything you're seeing on this interface uses the APIs that you have access to as well, so you could build a similar interface on your own. This automatically generated Swagger, half documentation, half mini application supports learning and demos and documentation as well. So with this, I'll mention that this is a pretty big list of stuff that you can already do, and this list will only grow. We're quite good now at thanks to the excellence on the team about producing these things according to best practices of API development in modern agile development. And we're interested in the workflows that these APIs support. If you have comments on those, that's something we're still actively considering. Although we put a lot of thought into these, but that's in order to prepare it for you all to actually give us the actual feedback and kick the tires a little bit. All right, so if we're going to list all data sets, you're filling out, there's a field for each piece of the metadata here. You can query for whatever you want, including things like bounding box, which we'll show in a second. And then you can run this, and if you run it, you'll get a response, but you'll also get an example of the curl command that you'll need to run. I'll be connecting using an API key for my user. You'll have your own API key, which you can see if you go to the dashboard here. And so if you want to try, let me ask actually, is anybody going to try any of this live? We have a few, yeah, Thomas is going to try it live. That's surprising no one. He's, so with that API key that you get from there, if you're going to use the Swagger interface, maybe speaking to Thomas, you can go up here to authorize, plug in your API key here. There's two different ways of doing this. One is a temporary authorization token by putting in your username and password. I'm not really going to show that because it's a little bit extra, a few extra steps. But if you just put in your API key, it'll work permanently for that user. Once you enter that, the rest of these calls should work. All right, so, but in my preferred environment here was to put together a little Jupyter notebook. You'll forgive the faculty quality code here as opposed to the developer quality code that we're used to in this area, but maybe that's for the best because it shows that even if I can put something together in a few hours, that means you can too. So all this is going to do is use this requests library. I'm going to put in the API key. I'm going to say that we expect JSON back. And then I'm going to use that call that we got from that Swagger interface and put in a couple of parameters here about page number and page size, which actually are optional. And we can run that. And so that's thinking here, and you get back a JSON list of a bunch of data sets that is everything that is associated with that project group that I'm in, as well as any release data sets. Perhaps that's too big of a list, so instead let's filter for something that's intersecting with a bounding box. And here I'm going to make the same API call, but I'm going to add a few more parameters to define the bounding box, and we can run that as well. And so now I've also filtered only for OSW data sets as opposed to GTF Flex or pathways. All right. Should I pause? How are you doing, Thomas?
You can proceed.
I think if we're, as long as we have at least one person connecting along the same way, then I think that's a victory.
Got my virtual environment and get a notebook running, et cetera.
I see. So, sorry, I meant to give you the link here. I flashed it on the slides, but I didn't call attention to it. So let me.
I did get the Swagger interface.
Well, Swagger, but actually this Jupyter Notebook itself is there, which might save you a step or two. Yeah.
That would be super useful.
It's a global namespace, so we have to add a lot of hyphens to make sure that it's unique with other acronyms out there. All right, so that, and hopefully that's, I think that's shared and available. And so if you speak Python, then this might be a more convenient way to move in. Now, with my API key is going to be in the Jupyter Notebook, which is fine for now. You can use it, but if you the right way would be to go to like the dashboard and get your own API key and put it in there. Either way is okay.
Just be expecting that link to let me download the Python notebook, move it into a folder where I can access it, et cetera.
That should be the case. Yeah.
Cool.
You'll be our test case if I forgot to hit the share button or something. But
Do my best. I am not a programmer.
Actually, just because I'm curious now, is anybody else going to try to hack along with us here in the same way? There's a are waving their hand. Okay, fantastic. All right, so people in the ether waving their hand. I saw a couple of these, so that's good enough. And again, if you get this notebook, you'll be able to actually just click it and run it too, so you don't actually have to write a line of code if you just want to try some of these things out. That may or may not be jaw-dropping for you, but at least we can try that. All right, so now you have a JSON list of data sets. So you're doing some data discovery. You're looking at where things are. You can kind of check out the metadata there and so on. And again, comments on literally anything are welcome here. But now we're going to actually download some data. So here, I change the application type we expect to a zip file because the OSW format, the standard, is a collection of GeoJSON files. One for points, one for edges, one for nodes, one for edges, and one for zones, along with the metadata that describes all that. All right, so you're going to get a little package of data there as a zip file and have to deal with it. That can complicate things. In fact, if you run that on Swagger, it's not great because Swagger doesn't like zip files coming down, and so it'll be a big binary block of bits, and so it hangs for a bit and so forth. But that's okay. So here, what I'm doing is just streaming that. Well, actually, I'm not streaming that. I'm loading that into a zip file object in Python and extracting it, and then inside that zip file is actually another zip file that holds the actual GeoJSON things, and so I'm doing that in this two-step process. All right, and so there's other data sets you can access here. Of relevance to some of us in the room, and it has a it's of medium size. One thing I think I've discovered here is the in the ecosystem of tools that support GeoJSON, there's a lot of them out there that are not very happy with very large GeoJSON files, and we're trying to figure out what we should do about that. So we're happy to serve them out to people, but it's not quite clear that the client-side tools that people want to do with things are happy to receive them when they get large. So we have our strategy for dealing with that, but we can talk about what that might look like. So I'm going to download the Bellevue data, and so the same thing. I'm using an API call here. I ask for this OSW, and I give it the dataset ID, which you can get from the UI, or you can get from this programmatically through this API call. It's one of these fields. Data, TDI, that's the service ID, right there at the top, TDI dataset ID, all right? And so if I run that, it's going to think for a little bit here because the Bellevue dataset's a little bit bigger. And if you use those curl commands, you'll see the same thing. It'll pause for a second and then you'll download it. So now Jupyter Notebook tells me that that's done. And so I've got on my local file system, I extracted all the GeoJSON stuff. I know the name of the thing that got extracted, so I hard-coded that here. And I'm going to read it into GeoPandas, which speaks GeoJSON, right? And then I'm just going to plot it. All right, so I'm not doing anything fancy with this yet, although now you're ready to put it into whatever other tool speaks GeoJSON. And so just to show that, which you already saw the result of that. I'm only looking at the edges. There's also a nodes file and a zones file, which you can also visualize in various ways, but I'm just trying to get a sense to make sure that it looks like what I expect the shape of Bellevue to look like. And so there it is, and that roughly looks like Bellevue, which you can verify by, looking at a map of Seattle if you like. All right. The Seattle data set you can download, but that will be a little clunkier as it gets by because it's I don't know, maybe about 5 times as large, I think. All right. So given these large data sets, one thing you might want to do is select by bounding box. Conceptually, this is pretty trivial, but the actual architecture involved in this, we put a little bit of thought into. It's not really, it's a little bit overbuilt for the bounding box query, but this is trying to set us up for more non-trivial analytics. To have this asynchronous kind of interaction so that you can support if you want to do some significant computation over the entire Bellevue data set and it takes a few hours, that's fine, we're set up for that. Nothing breaks, nothing is wrong. And so the interaction there gets a little bit more involved. You actually create a job for the bounding box query. Right, and so here, the only thing I've added, I think I'm moving away from the mic too much here. Sorry about that if people are on Zoom. I've developed a bounding box by looking at, I think, that openmaps.io interface and kind of zooming in on Bellevue and pulling something out of the middle of downtown. That's what this bounding box represents. You can use your own if you'd like. And I'm splicing that into the string here in order to go get an OSW file, but now I'm getting one that's just a subset. And so again, conceptually, this is sort of obvious and natural, but just the fact that on the server side we can crack open these files and pull down exactly what you want is already kind of a nice capability over what a lot of the file sharing systems that are out there provide. All right, so maybe I'll run that. And so what that returns is just a job ID, just a number. All right, so that doesn't do anything yet necessarily. Well, it is doing something on the server side, but it hasn't returned you that result. And then we use that job ID to go check and see, to poll and see when that job is done. In this case, it'll be pretty quick because it's a pretty simple thing. But again, we're looking ahead to large-scale analytics that we may want to do on your behalf as well. And so I'll run that. I think I did this right with job. Yeah, okay. And so there's the job status object that comes back, and it says completed because it only takes a couple seconds here in this case. And that job is ready, and therefore the result of that job is another OSW file that's ready to be downloaded, and you can get that whenever you want. It'll hang out there, and so I'm going to do that. I'm going to go ahead and fetch the subset data that we just created with that job, which is yet another call here where it's job and download, and you pass in the job ID for the result of the job ID for the result that you want. And I'm going to do the zip file dance again one more time because that's what's coming down as a zip file. All right. And so that's pretty quick now because it's much smaller. And I'll just draw it again, and now it's some subset of the downtown area within Bellevue. All right, so again, there's not much to this. You can do this with any sort of GIS system if you want. But we're trying to get that standards compliant in terms of the data that comes down, but also standards compliant in terms of the API best practices for working with this stuff so that to reduce barriers or eliminate barriers for programmatic access to doing whatever you want. And again, we're in the market for what else you might want to do with this data server side. All right. So I'm going to maybe end there and go back to, I'm going to that'll be the run through of code. But again, I'll highlight some of the other APIs that we already have here. There are APIs for converting things between formats and downloading those. You can request the different versions of data sets that are available. There's a set of APIs for OSW, but they're also set up for Flex and Pathways, many of which are kind of mirrored across them. There's job inquiry status. You can look at services and projects groups and do some administration, and so on. So that's the world we're in with TDI Core. What I wanted to do next was to, again, TDI Core is just that API interface. The whole point is to drive other applications. It's not just for sort of powering Jupyter notebooks and so forth. It's for actually building interactive applications of your own. And so another use case you might have is to edit one of these data sets using OSM tools, but do so in a way that's interactive with the TDI Core. So for example, it's always possible, but also I would argue always frustrating if the only way to interact with things is download it to your local machine and then sort of upload things back up, partially because files get really large, partially because standard versions or support for different standards may be variable across applications. There's always some friction. There's always some technical friction with that. And so we're trying to demonstrate that we can do these kind of integrated, cross-world integrations across not just tools, but also, ecosystems. And so the OSM ecosystem obviously is an important one to be able to connect with, and so we want to kind of show how that works as well. So you can start from multiple places here. You can start from within the app and access TDI, or you can start TDI Core and connect out to the app, and we don't care too much about the interface parts of it. That's easy to do if somebody wants something more convenient. But I'll start here and start with a UW campus data set. We might do this twice. I might show a UW campus data set. I might do it one more time so we can kind of connect with Access Map in a different way, because we had something we put together on the fly here recently. So this is a released data set just for UW campus, and I'm going to click this Open in Workspaces action. It's going to ask me to log in again, because now we're kind of in a parallel universe of OSM tools, right? We're kind of outside the TDI world, although it's connected. Yeah, please. Thank you.
Brian and I are, neither of us are assigned to project groups, and we can see the UW campus data, but don't have that rightmost button to click. The open in workspaces.
Yeah, action is not.
Try my project data sets as opposed to all release data sets.
We just have all release data sets. I think because we
you're
also
not
don't
assigned.
have the project group drop down up there next to our names.
I can assign you to the project group. I just need you to reply to my email after you register so that I know who's actually.
I see. There's another set. Okay,
So
so I'll reply to your email.
So we're not letting people self-select into project groups for, and that adds a step of administrative friction, but we think it'll scale pretty well with the human attention required. It's a good problem to have if we have so many requests to join project groups that we can't keep up with the manual step. Then I think we're going to be doing pretty well. Sure, yeah. Well, also I'm curious about online, whether people are actually following along or just pretending to, or have any questions. I feel lonely up here. So maybe prod them for a response online and see. Okay. And see if. Anybody else? How we doing? Is anybody in the room using the Jupyter Notebook?
Seems like Nina download the zip, and she's using it in VS Code.
There you go. All right. We can show a curl command too. You know, that's another way to access this stuff if you prefer Bash.
And Johan from Ontour, like, yes.
All right. So a little bit of engagement with this. All right, I might click through this process of editing in workspaces unless somebody wants me to pause a little longer or help out. We also have some folks in the room that can help out if you're interested in doing more but need some help.
So I'm not sure if this is an issue. Sai, I see I'm assigned to a project group now, but I still don't have the action column on the right side. Is that expected?
And you're on my project datasets as opposed to all released?
Oh, sorry, I need to also click that tab. Okay, user error.
Well, maybe, but I mean, we probably should make that a little more
Little
clear.
bit both. You know, it's always both.
I'm not sure anything is a user error at this point. Where there are only things to consider changing. And you know, this action column right now has that open in workspaces, but we're envisioning a number of different actions and connections to different applications and so on. I see. So I see Thomas, I see Nina, I see Melody, and some other folks here. So I'm going to go ahead and click this Open in Workspaces button, and we'll see how that works. And again, if you want me to slow down or talk about something, I would frankly love that. It's a little, this happens when I'm teaching sometimes too.
Querying by GeoJSON, custom bounding box.
Querying by GeoJSON, can I
So,
say
for
more?
example, I have a GeoJSON that describes my council district.
I think that I'm highly supportive of that. I think sort of plugging in a bounding box in the format of 4 query parameters in the URL is probably not ideal in how we interface this. So I think that's probably right. There are some standard ways of supporting things. There's no difficulty in the back end. Once we get through the how to express it in the API, it's pretty trivial. It's all going into kind of a PostGIS comparison. So we have access to all the sort of topological queries of containment or intersects or whatever. And so I would tend to agree. That'll be something we can discuss as a team, though. I mean, essentially, I would say the answer is both, right? Some people kind of prefer query parameters because they're easy and to deal with URLs. Other times it might be a little payload of GeoJSON that's the parameters. But both should be supported. I don't want to overpromise because I'm not going to be the one who's implementing it, but I'm pretty sure that's not that big a deal. Yes, there's a long-winded way of saying no, we don't support that right now, but it's a good idea. All right, I'm going to click this and walk through this process. So within workspaces, there were previously other ways to create workspaces. This tool pre-existed, well, by our team, but existed in our environment before the TDI existed, and now we're showing that you can kind of integrate these things without having to kind of deal with your own local data. And so I'm going to create a workspace from the data set that I found in TDI.
Can you describe some use cases why somebody would want to do this?
The ones that I think about, which are people in the room that are more expert than I am, including the person that asked the question, there's what I'm, being able to edit these data sets in a convenient way without having to sort of break out your programming tools. You know, we're trying to expose this to analysts who may or may not be prepared to, again, open up a Jupyter Notebook and start working with that. And so having that kind of seamless interface to it. So just being able to edit at all is one core use case. But maybe more importantly, with specifically here, is that you're interoperable with the OSM ecosystem. So given that we're now going to be able to put this data set into a thing called a workspace, we will show one editing tool that supports OSM, but there are other tools out there that also speak OSM, and all of those are now, modulo testing, all of those are now potentially available here. And this is this was a heavyweight lift for us to decide to do, right? It would be nice if we could just dump things out to OSM and let everybody connect directly to OSM, but because of some of the socio-technical considerations and design decisions that they made, we want the technical capabilities of that, but without taking on some of the burden that they place. And so this was a nice solution for us. So we have essentially a private OSM environment that you can connect to that is now increasingly integrated with TDI for data exchange. I sort of evaded your question a little bit, but other.
So internally, that's important, but it also supports exporting it to the community to do like their own vetting.
Right.
Exchange with the community.
Right. So I'll just regurgitate those words a little bit, but we think in terms of the analyst who's going to do something with this, but especially in this community, nothing scales very well, right? There's a lot of manual work to do. There's a lot of human attention. It's a very high touch exercise to do this vetting of data, and so we need a way to kind of empower the broader community and collaborate with other folks, and that means speaking whatever tools that they're used to using. It means developing some of our own tools that you'll see in a few minutes. But we need to figure out how to empower and make use of the community's attention on working with this data. All right, so that puts a higher bar for interoperability than perhaps we would if we were working with, I don't know, genomics data or something like that, right? You're not going to crowdsource your genomic analysis.
So, Doreen, I actually kind of wanted to follow up on Anat's question.
Yeah.
I don't know if you were here yesterday, but even what's meaningful for different blind people about space and what's there is, there's no standards. I mean, what my fantasy would be just a simple form where, if I go somewhere, I kind of do this on my blog, but if I go talk to a bunch of blind people about points and segments and JSON polygons, first of all, their eyes are going to glaze over.
Right.
They don't have eyes. If you give us a form with open-ended fields and then have somebody with capacity to go back, look at the forms and code it a little bit or tie it to specific geography, that would be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
That would be one way of being helpful, and that also seems like it could be a definable project that you might be able to partner about. So that would just be my observation.
Right.
I think the same thing would be true for like wheelchair users and where there's curb cuts and parking lots, and why blind people hate parking lots and driveways, but wheelchair users really need them.
Right.
So I mean, it is still high touch, and it's still high detail, and not, I'm not super familiar with the open format. Last time I looked, which was a while ago, I'm like, what I need isn't going to fit in that data. So
a couple.
Thinking about how to
Sure.
how to do that increment and how to also maybe make it fun and rewarding. I don't know.
No, it's great. I mean, I think the the philosophy here, as I was mentioning earlier, there is a bit of a danger zone on both sides, right? You start to sort of say, here are the 7 things that our applications care about. That's all you can really express. Then that's going to shut out a lot of use cases. Going to shut a lot of engagement and so on. On the other side, though, I think if it is completely open, free text, describe whatever you want, it's quite easy to, it's sort of schema on, we in the database where we talk about schema on read versus schema on write. And so there's kind of a no free lunch, right? Pay me now or pay me later. And so if we allow anything goes coming in, then somebody has to make it up on the other side. And so the philosophy right now, I think, is to try to strike that balance where we have, for example, in the OSW standard, there are capabilities for extensions that can be carried along with the file, even though we're not saying it's a formal part of the standard yet. We can still kind of carry that with it. So far, we've kind of resisted the temptation to allow completely open free text because we're afraid that it'll turn into soup that we can't make heads or tails of. However, if I'm, permission to speak freely, I think that there is a role for some learning to happen there, right? Where some machine learning to happen there, where we can let people sort of do whatever they want, and we start to guess how to interpret that properly and get some automation and mileage that way. So we might be able to get the best of both worlds thanks to what's happening with natural language understanding now in the past couple of years. That being said, that's not currently on the roadmap. That's just something we talk about sometimes. But what drives the roadmap is folks like yourself speaking up and asking for it and help us declare the use cases. So don't take that as a no. I want to make sure Anat has a chance to show other aspects of this editing workflow. So I'm within workspaces here, and this UW Campus TDI data set is the one I just connected to workspaces. Whoops, that's not the right button. And now I'm ready to edit it, and once I click that edit button, I'm now in something that looks like OpenStreetMaps, right? It's not OpenStreetMaps, it's hitting our private implementation of OpenStreetMaps, but you have all the same editing tools that you might have there. So here's the UW campus. One of the challenges in putting together this demo is our UW campus data set is so good that there's not a lot to edit anymore. So so if you found something out there on the footways as you were walking around campus and it's not represented here, please fix it. But I had trouble finding things I'm not the best mapper in the room by any stretch of the imagination, so you all perhaps would notice problems right away. But I don't tend to see any. So I was adding, we had a conversation yesterday about the zones versus paths, so I was adding line segments across red square as something that I thought potentially was useful here. So maybe I'll do something along those lines, no pun intended. So here's where we are, sort of. Not here. Here's the building we're in. We're on the 4th floor. Where this little area is right outside there. This, I think, is connected through the zone, but somebody tell me, is it worthwhile to connect these 2 points as a pathway? Would that actually stop routing? I guess it wouldn't because it's redundant? Okay, so it's redundant. Yeah, the folks doing this are too good here. Maybe I should delete something so I can screw it up for someone else to fix. Actually, there's probably some tags we can add here, right? So, this looks like it's, OSM is telling us that it's crossing a footpath, but it's not connected. Does anybody object if I say connect the features? All right. I mean, it doesn't really matter. These data sets are all ephemeral. Anyway, we'll process it. But so now I've made at least one change, and now I can hit save. This is all still the workflow of OSM, so save is not quite the right verb for what we're about to do with it. We're about to sort of push it back to TDI, but again, this is not our interface, so we don't control how this works. And I'll add a description, a demo for OTP, and I'll hit upload. And so it says uploading changes to OpenStreetMap, but that's not true. It's not going to the real OpenStreetMap. It's uploading changes to us. So if I go back over to the workspaces, I'm now still highlighted this one, which is in the right project group there. And now I'm going to actually, there's actually a 2-step process. I was a little speedy there. OpenStreetMap kind of pushed it back into workspaces. Now workspaces is going to push it back into TDI. And that extra shim that we need in between is relevant. So I'm going to give it another name. This actually should be a different version number, but that's a bit of a aging design here. So I'm going to give it a little tag to indicate what I did with it. And I'll hit upload. And so what happened here is I got another one of those job IDs because the upload process is actually a fairly heavyweight process for us because of all the validation and checking that we do on upload. And we're actually looking at ways to kind of speed that up because in some cases it can be a little bit of friction in how long it takes. But that being said, we also don't want to let people just upload any broken files and terrible stuff. So we're trying to strike that balance. So back in the CDI interface, my token expired there. That's from earlier, I guess. The job didn't. Oh, whoops, I'm in the wrong project group. And so there's the one I just uploaded, 11:27 a.m. It's a new data set. It's pre-release because the release is an extra step, so it's not exposed to anybody else except for people in this project group. And we could go back and do that whole workflow again and do some more editing. Right, so this is all things that people can do with enough, skills and integration with GIS systems and so on. But we're trying to think about how we can support these workflows to minimize friction for the variety of users that we know we have that need access to these tools. Let me pause there, given time, because I want to make sure that you have a chance to talk about the other tools. Is that right? I would love questions if we have them. That's the most important thing, I think. Yeah, please.
Hey, I'm wondering about, these are specific entities, and you showed downloading a version, editing it, and then uploading it, sort of like an SVN repository. And I'm wondering how you how do you do conflict resolution? That's all fine and good for when everybody is editing a specific area and you have it checked out. But I'm just wondering if you guys have thought about conflict resolution.
Oh, for sure. So one design decision right now is that these are actually separate data sets. That's not the right thing in every situation, but that's kind of a safe well, in my opinion, that's a safe default so that we have kind of everything we need. However, the fact that these are really, really similar except for one little change probably ought to be tracked somewhere in the system. And so some of the work that we have on the roadmap for the next 9 months before we actually do the release is to have a much more deeply integrated notion of change sets and provenance. And something kind of near and dear to my heart is once you have kind of a formal, I'll say, a principled notion of change sets, which is a little bit different than the way OSM processes them. We have an opportunity to do a little bit more than than the decisions they made back in the day. You can do some work with this. You can, for example, you can say, hey, here's 2 data sets. I don't know where they came from, but I can, somebody uploaded this one and somebody uploaded this one. But if someone says, hey, those names are kind of similar, I'd like to understand the relationship between these. Let's derive the edits that could be applied and sort of save that as provenance. Does that make sense? So we haven't built that yet, and there's parts of that are on the roadmap, but we want to have some non-trivial tools about sort of reconstructing the the derivation network between all these data sets while still allowing people to upload whatever they find lying around on their hard drive. I don't really want to prevent that from, I want to allow that into the system as it is, but then maybe recover after the fact that, oh wait, actually this is super similar to this other one. They're somehow related, and we want to be able to track that.
Yeah, it seems like it would also be helpful for combining data sets together from different provenances, and especially using some of the OSN data set where you have it,
100%.
and then using this there, and maybe something like the Gears IDs that that what Overture is using, or some sort of ID, so you're not having to do a spatial join.
Well,
somewhere.
so again, you're going to get into the philosophy department here a little bit, but I'm not a big fan of trying to lean. I can be talked at anything because I'm relatively new to this area,
It's
but
not an ideal solution by any means.
but I'm not a big fan of global IDs, in part because I just don't know. I can't ever guarantee that they mean what people claim they mean, right? It could be that. Trust me, this global ID 1234 is the same as this one. Meanwhile, they have different geometries, they have different things, they're in different cities because somebody made a mistake. And so in some sense, I feel like we're always going to be in the business of kind of checking the other metadata anyway, the other spatial extent of it anyway. And so might as well just commit to that's going to be our main bread and butter, is to say, rather than asserting these are the same because someone declared their IDs are the same, why don't we assert that they're the same because they satisfy a spatial join type of condition. And so
maybe in your case, since you're editing, you're focused on specific geographic areas, you could literally cut out and say this bounding box.
that's once we have the, what we're happy with right now, I think, is that we're, thanks to the brilliance of the team, the software engineering team we have, and the professionalism there, we have kind of the infrastructure to kind of start to play those fancier games with the actual content of the files, right? So the step one is to kind of get this basic infrastructure done, make sure it's scalable, make sure we're able to sort of process these things. But these are exactly the kind of conversations we want to have. If we find that people are wanting to kind of smush together two data sets they found, and like conflation, of course, is a big deal. We talk about it all the time. But even more than conflation, conflation is kind of like these definitely overlap, and I want you to fix up the problems. There's also just I've got a cutout over here that I want, and I've got a cutout over there I want, and I want to stop thinking of it as two separate files. I want to think of it as a common file. Yeah, just a uni, right? It's a conceptually trivial, and yet it's kind of a pain in the butt in practice for people to actually bother with. They have to go crack open their, coding or environments or their GIS tools, and so we want to kind of make that kind of thing easier. Same thing with the derivation history. Like I found this data set. It looks like it might be a Seattle sidewalks data set, but what am I going to do? Go through, piece by piece and try to see what the differences are? Let's provide that as a service, as an API call to say, diff this with the other one and help me understand what the differences are, and then I can maybe do some work with those. So we definitely want to get into that space as much as we can, driven by these kind of conversations. So I appreciate you bringing that up. It's almost like thanks for teeing that up for me, actually. Yeah.
One, just kind of to make sure I understand the functionalities that I'm looking at.
Sure.
I've been able to successfully follow along now with everything you've demoed here, and thanks to Sai for the last response. I did get in my junk email the separate OpenStreetMap login. So one, just to confirm, currently there's no editing pathway in this interface for pathways, and there's no flex data that I should be able to see. Are both of those statements true?
For this project group, I believe there is a flex data set, isn't there? I mean, it's just there. It's not the first part of the question is more important, and that's true. There's not a
No pathways editor. Totally
yeah,
fine. Yeah.
I mean, there exist pathway editors, but they're not demofied as integrated, so forth. Like
Okay.
this. Yeah.
Then I guess as a general comment, I mean, I think
Yeah. So here's iPathways data set that
right, and when I
that's
click open in workspaces, I can see that, but I can't go to.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
cool.
right. That's
Cool.
right.
Yeah, understood. So the way that we're selling this, so to speak, and speaking to the functionalities are about government agencies being able to access, vet, edit, share
Yeah.
authoritative data.
Right.
But I guess just like at a functional level, the percent of people who work at those types of organizations who are able to follow along with this process currently is infinitesimally small. And like most of those.
Even the editing workspace one, I mean, the Python, I definitely, 100%.
Yeah, I mean, once we're into the editing,
Okay.
maybe a little bit more. But yeah, we're like there are, this is a space where like I can follow along, but I'm uncomfortable. And just, I don't mean to talk myself up at all. I mean more so to maybe talk about just the functionality of these organizations. But like I'm probably in the 99th percentile of this type
Sure.
of skill set. There's certainly data analysts that are much more advanced to me. There's a long tail there of very advanced data analysts.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, like just the vast majority of the people. So I think we need to, if we're going to use that type of sales terminology in terms of what the functionality are, I think we really need to bring along with that clarity along with that message of what skill sets are expected.
100%.
Because if, I think there's a huge risk here basically of, oh yeah, I'm a GIS analyst who's comfortable in ArcGIS, but I don't really get into Python commands too much other than like within that interface. And now I've been told that I can do this, but I have this experience that just confuses the heck out of me.
Right.
And now I'm just like, I'm not even listening anymore.
This was unapologetically, at least the
Yeah.
first part there was unapologetically targeting,
Totally.
developers. But you're right, that is not actually the target.
Exactly.
That's
And so we got to
it's
like,
possible.
as we're kind of moving, like I understand, kind of in the development of these different tools, there's going to be that disconnect, and we're not going to be able to immediately deploy the interface that's going to work, and we're not going to immediately teach them the things that they need to know in order to. But I think we need to kind of like make sure that we're helping manage expectations essentially in that process of explaining what the tools do.
Maybe another way I'd reflect that back and see if it sort of matches is, as we write down these workflows, which we do, we think about, okay, there, as a so-and-so, I want to do this and this and this, make sure that that experience that we're describing, it might be step 1 and step 2 are fine, and step 3 and step 4 are fine, but somehow step 2 to 3, we actually required somebody to understand something about an API key or something that would have just blown them out of the water or something. So there's kind of a, be pretty aggressive about making sure that the experience that we want people to have is kind of described fully in terms of the skill sets you have, and then our job to kind of work backwards and make sure that we can kind of deliver those experiences. Anyway, I'm just slightly different words on saying the same thing, I suppose. But I think we could use some help on making sure that we have a kind of a bank of those workflows that are vetted. Where if we deliver on that experience, then we will capture the interests of a larger segment than the 1%. And so we're interested in it, but we may need your help to make sure that we're doing it right. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of coding projects at different levels of education that are, well, they do all kinds of things, but I think some coding projects where people can put on their resume the right buzzwords related to this kind of grows your labor pool. And the other piece of that is, okay, I think people who work in IT in different ways get used to learning as you go. Mm-hmm. And, there's different discussions about who's confident they'll apply for a job even if they don't have the exact experience. But building in the experience and then seeing that there's a place in the workforce is another way I come at it.
I think that's right. I mean, we're here on a university campus. One of the reasons why I like to think that the US DOT saw something here is that we are able to kind of connect with research on one end, and we're able to connect with student engagement on another. These are some assets that we have that are a little harder to pull off when you're at a nonprofit or at a company. And so I think there is a strength there and so we bring this into the classroom with regularity, especially Anat. It's a good idea, though. In fact, you're making me realize that we probably should do that sooner rather than later, is actually come up with some, turn even what we showed today into some kind of a class exercise or something. We haven't quite done that yet, but we could. The topic is very engaging for students, too, so it's kind of a win-win. Other thoughts? Other reactions? I know it's kind of bare bones here in a second, but again, that kind of API-forward design and architecture is the right way to do it nowadays. But sometimes it kind of what you actually end up seeing is a little developer oriented. And you get this experience with Amazon too. It's like you get on these console and you start doing this stuff and you're looking at it and you're like, I thought this was easy, and you have hundreds of buttons and sort of everything, and you're like, I need the cognitive load of operating their user interface is as hard as any sort of programming environment. So we're hopefully we won't get that bad, but that is kind of the nature of the beast a little bit.
If you asked me to log into the AWS interface, I'd walk out of it.
I haven't even matched passwords and logged into the portal, so.
I'll even just extemporaneously here, there is kind of maybe a principle here of a number of there's a segment of customers who are going to want to stay within an application or one or two applications or something, and that it's just this even the way I'm framing this is like, oh, there's a system over here, and architecturally it's connected to another system over here. It's already kind of sounding a little bit like what you just say. So there may need to be kind of we have some choices on how we integrate things, right? So for example, even here, there's a choice of staying within workspaces and kind of the TDI connections are mostly invisible, or the way I showed it, which is kind of crossing between them. There's going to be some people that are probably not comfortable with this idea of flipping over to another window to connect something. So anyway, it goes back to your point about we need to write down these workflows and make sure that we're designing for the right thing.
I may be misunderstanding sort of I'm not an OSM micromapper and stuff. That's not, I know, right? It's kind of disappointing,
Why not?
A number of people, but, so I may be misunderstanding kind of the purpose of that interface, but I guess like one question I have is just like, as far as the basic introduction and user interface for TDEI, is there a reason why it's not just the OSM interface with the TDEI logo in the top left, and that's it? Like, is there a reason why that's not what we're looking at right now?
You mean as opposed to, let's see, so admittedly there are.
And I see the UW, like, basically,
Yeah.
why am I not starting there?
Yeah, so maybe two questions there, both closely related. One is why you're not starting there, and that's, what I just sort of mentioned is I can imagine that some people might be, I do editing, right? That's what I do. I want to go to my editing. It's fine if it's your special, WashDOT approved University of Washington built editing, they're fine, whatever. But the point is I want to go to one place and do my work. I don't want to have to think about this whole nonsense. I think another aspect of what I just showed is that there were essentially three systems involved, right? There's something in TDI, and then there's this workspaces thing, and then you go to the editor, and then you go back and so forth. This can all be sort of cleaned up. This is basically showing that we can integrate these things behind the scenes with the APIs, but that actual experience is not the way it's going to be permanently, because why would it be? Most of that stuff's pretty easy though. Once we have the, do you really want to click a link inside TDE Core and click out to the thing and then approve it again and then log in and so forth, or do we want to make that more seamless? We absolutely can. We just are kind of showing that the plumbing can exist. So
more research to be done in thinking about what the best portal is to log into and have government employees interact with. But it may get to the point where, we just have tcat.osm.edu and you log in and you do stuff and you walk away.
certainly for the editing workflow, that doesn't sound terrible, right? That sounds like probably the right idea. For other, there are other use cases that are more analyst oriented or read oriented, and maybe we'll show, AccessMap, for example. They'll log into AccessMap and look at it, and there'll be a bunch of exchange back and forth with TDI and sharing and provenance and so forth going on, but you don't really interact with that very much. You just do your routing, right, or do your analysis.
And
So
to the extent that then people know how to edit OSM, that skill is directly transferable.
Yeah.
that was the big reason,
Yeah.
was that we don't want to build that tool again, right? That already exists. People already know it. So we got to somehow connect to it. Yeah, let the person knows what she's
So
talking
I
about.
would argue that that endpoint actually is part of this already, in a sense, because once Thomas, who owns the data set, says, okay, my release in the TDI is now ready for internal editing,
Right.
you push that to workspaces, and all you give your folks who are editing is that link. And that's how Cole, who's online, just now internally edited the Health Through Housing King County Metro instance in Redmond, for example. So he only has access to that with the tasking manager that allows people to coordinate their editing over there. He is not interacting with the general TDI at all. That was something that I released out to him so that he can vet that data.
So maybe I, as like, maybe if I'm like future system admin of this system at WashDOT, I'm dealing with this stuff, but then I'm provisioning to other WashDOT employees the tailored tools and interfaces that they need to interact with the data.
Right, and the current release on the TDI for Ontour to consume remains the released vetted version that you pushed without all these edits until you're ready for re-releasing the data again.
Right.
That was important for some of our stakeholders who really wanted like a clear release structure and cycle. So I would venture to say that it is kind of there. You just don't show that link. You only show that link. You don't necessarily share the general.
Right. Okay.
So this is AccessMap, the Redmond one that Sam put together. Is there something useful to talk about here?
Sure, I should say the following, because Olivia is very serious about this. Everybody needs their lunch. Like, find your lunch and come back, and we'll answer more questions, and then I'll address this question right away.
Okay, so we're gonna finish this up by talking about a very specific use case, but demonstrating how it can, how the system can be used. So, about a month ago, Matthew Widener connected me with King County and Health Through Housing, who are orchestrating a huge endeavor of transitional housing units, 14 of them in different places in King County. And the interest there is to be able to get sidewalk data sets for the walk sheds of all of those 14 facilities, being able to understand how people can be connected to transit and other services within those environments to ensure the greatest maximal success of people who are transitioning into housing there. And so what this took, it meant that we needed to create a project group in the TDI to orchestrate these 14 separate data set collections. And so we have a working group. Do you want to
Sure.
flip to that?
Yeah, we're in it, actually.
Oh, great.
Well, it's named.
Yeah, okay. So we're now in a different work group that was not open to the participants here today, but we have a number of these health through housing data sets here. And so the data itself is there. It was opened in workspaces. So I am now the facilitator of that work group. And so I wanted to open specifically the facility in Redmond. And I wanted one of our team members, Cole, to be able to edit that data set and make sure that the sidewalks in that data set are real, that they're there, that they're connected. So Cole had access through workspaces to a tasking manager, which is one of the tools through the OSM ecosystem, to be able to kind of organize the way by which he's editing that data set. And so if you're able to see do you have the link to the tasking manager?
Well, what we did was, we did this the exact same thing we just showed.
yeah,
Went into
okay.
workspaces. That showed up to create a new workspace with his health through housing. And now we're going to edit it the same way we did before.
I see.
And so now we're going to make some change, and that's all we're going to do, I guess. Right?
Okay, so external to this, what we didn't show is that I was able to also create a project management environment for that, so that he's not just like looking at the entire data set, which is sometimes too much to consume, but is able to look at it sort of tile by tile so that we can organize our collective effort in editing.
I see.
But here is the result in an OSM viewer of the resulting data that Cole went through in the past 2 weeks and finished that editing tour through the data. Now that this is in our private OSM,
And we can break something here, or we can edit something. Do you have any?
well, first let's show what Access Map was consuming when it's connected to that. So we have an additional tool to allow people to now actually use this for routing. So Access Map consumes data directly from that workspace, and we're able to, produce routes within that health through housing facility in Redmond, being able to see, how people would accessibly navigate, let's say, from, I believe this is where the location of the facility is, to Overlake Village, for example. So the accessible route there does not exist, because if a person actually needs to avoid raised curbs and stairs, they're unable to reach that facility. But if we remove the requirement for lowered curbs, then the router is able to identify a route for them. So already we are finding, instances where a little bit of an on-the-ground improvement can facilitate people's access to services and locations. But that's not the point. The point is that now, let's say that this was in error, and we want to go back and we found out that that crossing actually is accessible.
I don't know where you were exactly.
Yeah, where was I? Here it is, okay. We can go in and edit these two curb ramps. I'm gonna do that on the fly here. Cole's gonna get very mad that I've ruined his. Sorry, Cole. Okay.
New data set anyway.
Okay, what's that?
It'll be a separate data set anyway.
I see. Do you want to?
Yeah.
So now I've saved those edits, making it accessible for someone to navigate to that area. Going back to workspaces.
It was saved.
Did we
Oh,
notice
oh,
that?
did I not save it? Oh, sorry, that's right, I didn't finish. So you gotta put in, upload that. Gotta save your work.
And we'll say, you know, OTP.
So what he's doing now is ensuring that we're saving this as a separate data set in workspaces because we're not touching the release in the TDI that it's tied to.
There it is, back in the TDI.
So this is now pushed back to the TDI.
But we have one more step we have to do to release it, otherwise Access Map
Oh.
can't see it.
But for Access Map to consume it, you do have to release it because Access Map will take whatever is the latest and greatest release for that data.
So now I'm using that Swagger interface. It's not part of the UI right now. That's okay. Kicked it off.
So through a CI/CD magic, this will happen in 2 minutes. So in 2 minutes, this will be updated and Access Map will consume it. While we're waiting, I'll tell you that there's also an on-the-ground editing capability. So if we sent out Jay Wells to go actually change that curb ramp in the public right-of-way, Jay is able to, through a mobile device, comment on the data set to say, look, this is now really lowered, not Anat just did it in the background. And be able to then instantiate the same thing where Access Map will, what's that?
I was making eyes at Sam. Do you see your change in there?
Yeah, you have to, so if we change this back, it's not quite yet there. So, it'll take a minute or two. It's good, that's all good. I have faith.
Oh,
What's that? It was rebuilt? Okay. Did I miss where we were going? No, we're going to Overlake Village. I'll start from here. Let's see. I'm pretty sure.
can we visibly see the changes there?
Go ahead.
Do you see that change you made? Or no, we
No,
have to,
no,
you
it's
can't
not.
because it's a tag that has to.
No, no, it's just not there. It says no curb ramps. It would have said yes, curb
I see,
ramps.
I
but-
see.
Anyway, so the accompanying mobile application will enable the same kind of editing, but without having to have somebody know anything about the ID editor or desktop type of editing. What we're trying to obviate there is this lengthy handshake type of process that typically happens between people who do projects and project management in the public right-of-way versus those who maintain the data up to date. So cutting out that process of how to communicate those changes, but letting people who are on the ground and made the changes to actually communicate that directly with the data set. Any questions on that? The last thing I wanted to mention before we let Chad speak is that, and this is a question that came up in the Zoom chat as well. The question was, how do you allow people to actually synchronize back to OpenStreetMap if they do wish to do that? And currently, our mechanism is an agreement with Esri, who have a feature server that's connected to the Rapid deployment. And so people are able to directly connect to Rapid in the slides when you visit the slides. If you visit the slides, you'll have a link to the Rapid deployment, and you can choose to be a power user, and then you have access to our data set predicting sidewalks for all of Multnomah County, for example. And that allows people in crowds or people that, let's say, ODOT chooses to allow in to be able to edit into OSM whatever data they're publishing, so that there will be increased synchronization across those different systems, but doesn't require anybody to actually, in order to produce data, you don't absolutely have to have the access to the labor required to vet every single element into OSM. Any questions on that? Yeah.
How does it go the other way? So,
Yeah.
into this.
Great question. So actually, that came up in the chat as well. We have agreed with MetaMaps to have our own branch of Rapid, which will then allow people to ingest and merge outside data sets, including OSM exports, or something you have from past life in King County Metro, or something like that. To have rapid editing specific to OSW, so to Open Sidewalk, so it's aware of the schema and is able to semi-automate some of that merging, but still allow for manual conflation of any elements that are sort of similar but not really sure, or what the tags are, so that will allow for some of those the thornier merges to be done manually. I see a hand. Yes, Elizabeth.
Cool, but I'm worried about the licensing of OpenStreetMap data. Doesn't that then infect your data with ODBL licensing?
Yes, it does. And so we make it really clear that if you use this tool, you are now subject to ODBL licensing for this data.
And so then and part of the ODBL, I'm always confused by ODBL.
Yeah.
So does that mean then that the resulting data set has to be then publicly available again and published, right?
That's right.
And so.
Well, it means that you have to ODBL share that data, so you can share it through TDI as ODBL licensed, because
Okay.
because you used input from OSM to inform your release. That's right.
And so that would mean that you would have to, but it still has to be publicly available through TDI, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Which is, in a way, where everyone is openly sharing the data in TDI. The biggest question is, though, what is the licensing associated with this specific data set? So let's imagine, actually, this is a true case. King County Metro has been collecting open sidewalks data since 2018, not using OpenStreetMap information as part of that collection. So they can license it with whatever license they want. If and when they decide to use any OpenStreetMap data to inform the next release, then they'll have to publish that data under ODBL. And so we're not changing any of that. We're just facilitating the merge to happen in a tool called Rapid that has its own branch that's specific to sidewalks.
And in the metadata about that data set within TDEI, it would be clearly marked for people downloading it that there's an ODDL license on this particular data set within TDEI.
Right. Great questions. I love that. Yes, more questions.
Sorry, you talked about mobile application. How does that work altogether? And is that something that we could foresee having? I guess I'm figuring out how to do that.
Okay.
So yeah.
In this slide, I never got to. We essentially are showing that, there's a way to publish to OSM through Esri feature services. There's also through TDI workspaces. We have our GoInfo mobile application. I'll cut through the workspaces. I'll just go straight to so this was published to workspaces. Now it will be available. Okay, so here is that same data set in workspaces now available to a mobile app. A user is in the public right of way. They have the ability to comment on, so different organizations may choose to ask different questions about what's out there. So in the Health Through Housing example, our folks from Health Through Housing don't know this yet, but Nick is interested in having people on the ground comment on access in those environments and facilities so that people going through the transitional housing experience are able to comment back about the public right of way there and let people know if there are barriers there. So they will be so King County and King County Metro helping with access to transit there will enable certain queries about, was there a curb ramp here? Is the curb ramp good? They get to choose what these questions about the public right-of-way might be. In the instance of Jay Wells, who's actually doing projects on the public right-of-way, maybe the questions there are directed towards actual ADA compliance of the curb ramp, but it wouldn't be the same questions that are targeted to these different populations. And we can sort of help organizations identify what are the questions they want to be able to ask about the facilities that they manage, the assets that they manage. Did that answer the question?
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, I talked long past my my end.